There is a moment in the original Dune novel that most readers pass over without a second thought. Duke Leto Atreides is sitting in a briefing room on Caladan, days before his household is scheduled to depart for Arrakis. His advisors are talking logistics, troop deployments, water discipline, but Leto's not listening. He is thinking about a single question that has kept him awake for weeks. Not whether the Harkonnens will attack. He knows they will. The question gnawing at him is simpler and far more terrifying. Which of the other great houses will help him when they do? The answer, as we eventually learn, is none of them. Not one. And the reason none of them lift a finger to save House Atreides is not cowardice, it is not indifference. It is the system working exactly as it was designed to work. The Landsraad, that great assembly of noble houses stretching across thousands of worlds, is not a parliament built to protect its members. It is a cage built to contain them. And to understand why Leto Atreides had to die, why no rescue fleet ever materialized, why the entire galactic aristocracy watched one of their finest families get butchered and did nothing, you have to understand how that cage was constructed, who holds the keys, and why every single house inside it is simultaneously a prisoner and a guard. So let us begin, where all power in the known universe begins. Not with people, not with armies, with a substance. Melange, the spice, the one commodity in the Imperium that cannot be synthesized, cannot be replaced, and cannot be done without. The Spacing Guild needs it to fold space, which means interstellar travel depends on it entirely. The Bene Gesserit need it to unlock prescience and maintain their breeding programs. The Emperor needs it because its tax revenue funds his throne. Every noble house needs it because their CHOAM dividends, the lifeblood of aristocratic wealth, rise and fall with spice production quotas. Remove spice from the equation, and the entire feudal architecture of the Imperium collapses overnight. Every political alliance, every marriage pact, every declaration of Canley, every vote cast in the Hall of Oratory traces back, eventually, inevitably, to that cinnamon-colored dust blowing across the deserts of Arrakis. This is the first thing you must understand about the Landsraad. It is not a governing body in the way we think of governments. It is a marketplace of fear. And the currency is proximity to spice. Now, to understand how that marketplace functions, we need to map the three pillars that hold the Imperium upright. Frank Herbert called it the tripod of power. And like any tripod, remove one leg and the entire structure falls. The first leg is the Padishah Emperor and his household, House Carino. For over 10,000 years, the Carinos have sat on the Golden Lion throne, projecting an image of inevitable, almost divine authority. But that authority rests on something far more tangible than tradition. It rests on the Sardaukar. These are soldiers recruited from the prison planet Salusa Secundus, a world so brutal, so ecologically hostile, that simply surviving childhood there produces warriors of extraordinary ferocity. The death rate among the general population of Salusa Secundus is staggering. Herbert suggests that 6 out of every 13 young people die before reaching maturity. Those who survive are hard in a way that no amount of conventional military training can replicate. They have been forged by suffering, and the Emperor channels that suffering into the most feared fighting force in the known universe. The Sardaukar are the Emperor's ultimate argument. When diplomacy fails, when economic pressure is insufficient, when a house grows too ambitious or too defiant, the Sardaukar descend, and worlds burn. But here is the critical detail that makes the entire power structure function. The Emperor guards the secret of the Sardaukar's origins with absolute ferocity. The other houses know the Sardaukar are formidable. They do not fully understand why. They suspect that Salusa Secundus plays a role, but the Emperor maintains the fiction that his soldiers are simply better trained, better equipped, better led. If the great houses ever truly understood the Sardaukar recruitment method, they could replicate it on any sufficiently harsh world. And that realization is precisely what allows Paul Atreides to later recognize the Fremen for what they are. Desert people hardened by a world even more brutal than Salusa Secundus. Sardaukar quality soldiers hiding in plain sight. The second leg of the tripod is the Spacing Guild. They control all interstellar travel without exception. No ship moves between star systems unless the guild permits it. They're navigators, mutated by massive spice consumption into something barely recognizable as human, fold space itself to allow instantaneous travel across unimaginable distances. This gives the guild an effective veto over every military operation, every trade route, every colonial venture in the Imperium. The guild rarely exercises this power openly, preferring to operate through economic leverage and quiet threats. But every house in the Landsraad understands the implicit warning. Cross the guild, and your planet becomes an island. No imports, no exports, no reinforcements, no escape. Isolation, followed by slow economic death. Consider what that means in practical terms. A world under guild embargo cannot receive food shipments if it is not self-sufficient in agriculture. It cannot export its manufactured goods. It cannot receive medical supplies or technological components. Its military cannot be reinforced or evacuated. In a civilization that spans thousands of star systems, a world cut off from guild transport is not merely disadvantaged, it is dead. It just has not stopped breathing yet. The guild's relationship with the Landsraad is fascinating, precisely because it is so transactional. The guild does not care about politics. It does not care about honor or lineage or ancient grudges between noble families. It cares about the uninterrupted flow of spice. Anything that threatens spice production threatens the guild. And anything that threatens the guild threatens the entire structure of interstellar civilization. This makes the guild simultaneously the most powerful and the most conservative force in the Imperium. They will tolerate almost any political arrangement, any atrocity, any betrayal, as long as the spice keeps flowing. Their moral neutrality is, in its own way, the most terrifying thing about them. The third leg is the Landsraad itself, the assembled great houses and their countless minor house vassals. Herbert never gives us an exact number, but the Dune Encyclopedia, which Frank Herbert wrote the introduction for, suggests there are roughly 150 great houses in the Landsraad, with thousands of minor houses beneath them. Individually, no single house can match the Emperor's Sardaukar, but collectively, the combined military forces of the Landsraad dwarf the Imperial army many times over. This is the fundamental equation that keeps the Emperor from becoming a true dictator. He cannot attack the houses as a body, they would crush him. And they cannot attack each other with impunity because the Emperor and the guild would intervene to prevent any single house from growing powerful enough to upset the balance. It is a beautiful system, in the way that a loaded mousetrap is beautiful. Every component is precisely calibrated. Every actor is simultaneously threatened and threatening. And nobody, not the Emperor, not the guild, not any great house, can afford to be the first one to blink. This balance did not emerge by accident. It was engineered over millennia. And its foundation is the Great Convention, the closest thing the Imperium has to a constitution. The Great Convention emerged from the ashes of the Butlerian Jihad, that ancient crusade against thinking machines that had left humanity scattered and fragmented across the stars. In the chaos that followed, as old alliances crumbled and new powers rose, the surviving leaders of humanity recognized that they needed a framework to prevent the kind of total annihilation that the war against the machines had nearly brought about. The result was the Convention, and its most critical provision was elegantly simple. No house shall use atomics against human targets. The family atomics, those planet-killing weapons that every great house keeps in its vaults like a loaded gun in a nightstand drawer, are a deterrent only. Use them against people, against cities, against armies, and the full weight of the Landsraad descends upon you. Total destruction. No appeal, no negotiation, no mercy. This ban is the bedrock upon which everything else rests. Without it, any sufficiently desperate house could simply vaporize its rivals and seize their holdings. The Convention makes that option suicidal. It forces conflict into narrower, more controllable channels. And those channels, those sanctioned forms of aristocratic violence, are where the real genius of the Landsraad system reveals itself. The Hall of Oratory, The physical space where the Landsraad convenes deserves attention here because Herbert understood something profound about political theater. The hall is not just a room where votes are counted. It is a stage, a performance space where houses project strength, forge alliances, and destroy rivals through rhetoric as lethal as any blade. The minor houses, those smaller families without the wealth or military strength to stand alone, form voting blocks within the hall, leveraging their collective voices to extract concessions from the great houses who need their support. A great house proposing a new trade regulation or a shift in CHOAM dividend allocations must court these minor house blocks with the same care a medieval king might court his barons. Promise too little and you lose the vote. Promise too much and you bankrupt yourself or empower a rival. The public speeches in the Hall of Oratory are only the visible surface of a much deeper system. The real decisions are made in the corridors outside, in private suites, over meals where poison is always a possibility and where every word is weighed for hidden meaning. Herbert drew heavily on Byzantine court politics here, and it shows. The Landsraad operates on a principle that would be familiar to any student of the Eastern Roman Empire. What is said publicly is theater. What is agreed privately is policy. And the gap between the two is where fortunes are made and dynasties fall. But what happens when the theater breaks down? When the private agreements fail and genuine hostility erupts between houses? This is where Canley enters the picture. Canley, the formal vendetta, the blood feud with rules. In our world, we tend to think of vendettas as chaotic and destructive. One family kills a member of another family, the other family retaliates, and the cycle of violence spirals until everyone is dead or exhausted. The Imperium looked at this pattern, this ancient human tendency toward revenge killing, and rather than trying to eliminate it, they did something remarkable. They codified it. They gave it structure, ritual, legal standing, and boundaries. When two houses declare Canley, they are essentially filing a legal notice with the Landsraad that a state of formal hostility exists between them. This declaration requires documentation of the original grievance, witnesses from neutral houses, and formal acknowledgement from both parties of the terms of engagement. Once Canley is declared, both houses are permitted to use a range of aggressive tactics against each other: espionage, sabotage, targeted assassination, economic warfare. But there are limits, critical limits. You cannot harm civilians who are not directly involved in the feud. You cannot use weapons of mass destruction. You cannot target the enemy's population centers with indiscriminate violence. You cannot involve third-party houses without their explicit consent. The War of Assassins, which is the operational expression of Canley, is meant to be surgical, a scalpel, not a bludgeon. Two houses locked in Canley are expected to go after each other's leadership, each other's military assets, each other's intelligence networks. The goal is to weaken, to pressure, to force a negotiated settlement or decisive strategic victory without dragging the entire sector into a bloodbath. Think of it as dueling rays to the scale of planetary politics. Two nobles who despise each other do not burn each other's cities. They send their best swordsmen, their cleverest spies, their most cunning poisoners. The famous assassination attempt against Paul Atreides using a hunter-seeker, that tiny suspensor-buoyed needle guided by a human operator hiding in the walls of the Arakeen Palace, is a perfect example of Canley in action. It is targeted. It is deniable. And if it had succeeded, it would have decapitated Atreides' leadership without harming a single civilian. The Harkonnen attack on Arrakis, by contrast, pushed Canley to its absolute outer limits, and arguably beyond them. The scale of the assault, the use of disguised Sardaukar, the wholesale slaughter of Atreides' troops and retainers, these were borderline violations of the Canley Code. But the Emperor's involvement was hidden. The Harkonnens had ancient grievances to cite, and the Landsraad could plausibly convince itself that the forms had been observed even if the spirit had been violated. Canley also serves a critical pressure release function. In any feudal society, grievances accumulate. Old insults fester. Economic competition breeds resentment. Without some mechanism for resolving these tensions, they would eventually explode into uncontrollable war. Canley provides that mechanism. It allows houses to prosecute their grudges within a framework the rest of the Imperium can tolerate. The other houses watch these contests with keen interest, taking careful note of which families fight with skill and which fight with desperation, because those observations will shape their own alliances for decades to come. And there is a deeper psychological dimension to Canley that Herbert only hints at, but that pervades the entire culture. Canley is not merely permitted, it is, in certain circumstances, expected. A house that suffers a grievous insult and does not declare Canley is seen as weak. A house that loses a war of assassins but fights with honor retains its reputation. But a house that allows itself to be humiliated without response loses something far more valuable than soldiers or territory. It loses the perception of strength. And in the Landsraad, perception is the only currency that truly matters. The other houses do not need to know your actual troop strength or your actual financial reserves. They need to believe you are dangerous enough to be left alone. Canley is, among other things, a mechanism for advertising that danger. Now, behind the drama of Canley and the War of Assassins lies a quieter, colder form of power, the kind measured not in soldiers or spies, but in share certificates. CHOAM, the Combine Honete Ober Advancer Mercantiles, the largest commercial entity in the known universe, a megacorporation so vast that it makes every real-world conglomerate look like a neighborhood shop. CHOAM controls all major economic development across the Imperium. Mining, manufacturing, agriculture, water reclamation, terraforming, pharmaceutical production, everything of significance passes through CHOAM's ledgers. And its directorships, the seats on its board, are distributed among the great houses in strict proportion to their political standing within the Landsraad. A house's voting power in the Landsraad directly correlates with its CHOAM shares. More shares mean larger dividends. Larger dividends mean more wealth to fund armies, purchase alliances, bribe officials, and maintain the elaborate household that aristocratic status demands. More wealth means more political influence. More political influence means more CHOAM shares. It is a feedback loop that rewards the powerful and punishes the weak with mathematical precision. And at the center of this economic web sits Arrakis. Whoever controls Arrakis controls the spice. Whoever controls the spice extracts a percentage from every transaction in the Imperium because the guild's navigation fees are denominated in spice, and those fees are baked into the cost of every commodity shipped between worlds. The fief of Arrakis is not merely valuable. It is the valve through which the economic lifeblood of 10,000 worlds flows. Herbert understood something that many science fiction writers miss. In any imperial system, the true seat of power is not the capital. It is the treasury. And the treasury of the Imperium is not a vault. It is a desert planet infested with sandworms, swept by storms that can strip flesh from bone, where water is so scarce that the dead are rendered down for their moisture. That the most valuable real estate in the universe is also one of the most inhospitable places human beings have ever tried to inhabit is not an accident. It is a metaphor Herbert returns to again and again. Power and suffering are married to each other in Dune, and Arrakis is the altar where the ceremony takes place. The hidden costs of maintaining a great house are staggering, and Herbert gives us just enough detail to appreciate the precariousness of aristocratic life. A great house must maintain a standing military, fund intelligence operations across dozens of worlds, support a diplomatic corps, pay tribute to the emperor, purchase guild transport for trade and military movements, maintain planetary estates and infrastructure, fund the education of heirs, and keep sufficient reserves to survive an economic downturn or an unexpected military challenge. One bad spice harvest on a vassal world, one failed trade venture, one unexpectedly expensive military campaign, and a house that seemed invulnerable can find itself teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. And in the Landsraad, financial weakness is a death sentence. The other houses will sense it the way predators sense an injured animal, and the vultures will begin circling long before the corpse has cooled. This is why the Emperor's gift of Arrakis to the Atreides was so diabolically clever. It looked like an extraordinary opportunity. The wealthiest fief in the Imperium handed to a deserving house. But the transition costs alone were ruinous. Moving an entire household, an entire military apparatus, an entire administrative infrastructure from a water-rich world like Caladan to a desert planet required expenditures that would strain even the wealthiest family. And the Harkonnens, who had held Arrakis for 80 years, had spent those decades embedding agents throughout the planet's infrastructure. Leto was inheriting not a functioning operation, but a sabotaged one, riddled with loyalists and booby traps, both literal and political. But the Landsraad is not shaped only by the actors who sit within it. There are hands moving in the shadows, shaping bloodlines and marriages and alliances across centuries with the patience of gardeners tending a plot that will not flower for generations. The Bene Gesserit, the sisterhood. They operate within the system as advisors, as consorts, as mothers of heirs, as truth-sayers for the Emperor himself. Every major house has at least one Bene Gesserit attached to it in some capacity. And the sisterhood uses these positions to gather intelligence, influence policy, and most importantly, guide the genetic destinies of the great families. Lady Jessica was supposed to be the sisterhood's agent within House Atreides, guiding the Atreides bloodline according to a breeding program that had been unfolding for thousands of years. She was ordered to produce a daughter who would then be married to Fade Rotha Harkonnen, merging two powerful genetic lines and bringing the program one step closer to its ultimate goal, the Kwisatz Haderach. Instead, out of love for Leto, she bore a son, Paul. And in that single act of maternal defiance, she shattered a plan that had been in motion for 90 generations. From the Bene Gesserit's perspective, the Landsraad is not a political institution at all. It is a garden. The great houses are plants to be cultivated, pruned, cross-pollinated, and occasionally uprooted when they grow in the wrong direction. The sisterhood does not care who sits on which throne. They care about the genome. They care about producing a super being who could access both masculine and feminine genetic memory and bridge space and time with his prescience. Everything else, the wars, the alliances, the betrayals, is weather, transient, irrelevant to the deep work of shaping the species across millennia. Their Missionaria Productiva, that program of seeding protective religious myths on worlds throughout the Imperium, is perhaps the most chilling example of their long-term thinking. Centuries before any Bene Gesserit might need to take refuge on a given world, the Missionaria plants legends about powerful women with supernatural abilities, creating a cultural expectation that will protect a stranded sister when the time comes. When Jessica and Paul flee into the desert after the Harkonnen attack, they find the Fremen already primed with prophecies about a Bene Gesserit mother and her prophetic son. The trap was set generations earlier, and it works perfectly, though not in the way the sisterhood intended. The Bene Gesserit are not the only shadow players. The Tleilaxu sell their Golas, their face dancers, their twisted Mentat creations to any house willing to pay, regardless of political consequences. Face dancers in particular represent a uniquely terrifying weapon in the context of Landsraad politics. These are beings who can perfectly mimic any human being, replacing advisors, ambassadors, even family members with copies that no ordinary observer can detect. A house that suspects a face dancer has infiltrated its ranks faces an impossible dilemma. Trust no one and paralyze your own operations, or continue as normal and risk being destroyed from within. The Ixians push the boundaries of the Butlerian prohibition against thinking machines, producing technologies the Imperium officially condemns and privately covets, from no-field personal shields to sophisticated surveillance devices that would make any Landsraad intelligence operation exponentially more effective. Each of these factions operates within and around the Landsraad, pulling strings the noble houses cannot always see, creating a political environment of staggering complexity where every alliance conceals a hidden agenda and every act of apparent loyalty might be a move in someone else's centuries-long game. So we return to the question that haunted Duke Leto in that briefing room on Caladan. How do you survive in a system like this? The answer lies in understanding what the Landsraad truly is beneath its ceremonies and its legal codes and its elaborate rituals. It is not a government. It is not an alliance. It is an agreement among predators. Every great house understands, on some fundamental level, that the other houses would destroy it if they could do so without unacceptable cost. The Landsraad exists not because its members trust each other, but precisely because they do not. The rules, the conventions, the Canley protocols, the CHOAM structures, the atomic span, all of these are mechanisms for managing distrust. They do not eliminate the desire for conquest. They raise the price of conquest to the point where it becomes more profitable to coexist. As long as the price stays high enough, the system holds. The moment it drops, someone makes a move. Emperor Shaddam IV understood this, which is why his conspiracy against the Atreides was so carefully constructed. He needed to lower the price of destroying Leto without lowering the price of challenging imperial authority more broadly. He needed to make the Atreides fall look like a private matter between old enemies rather than an act of imperial aggression. And he very nearly succeeded. The Harkonnens would take the blame. The Sardaukar would wear Harkonnen uniforms. The Landsraad would cluck its collective tongue, offer sympathies, and do nothing. Because doing nothing was safe. Doing nothing was rational. And in the Landsraad, rational self-interest always wins. The other houses might privately mourn the Atreides. They might even feel a twinge of guilt, but they would look at their own children, their own holdings, their own CHOAM dividends, and they would stay silent. That silence is the sound the Landsraad makes when it is working as designed. Not the roar of debate in the hall of oratory, not the clash of assassins in the corridors. The silence of 150 families choosing not to risk their own survival for someone else's. That is the real sound of Landsraad governance. What Shaddam did not anticipate was Paul, a boy who was never supposed to exist. A young man who combined the genetic legacy of both Atreides and Harkonnen bloodlines with prescient abilities unlocked by massive spice exposure and the guerrilla capabilities of the Fremen, a people the Imperium had spent centuries ignoring. Paul did not just survive the destruction of his house. He used the Fremen, those desert-hardened warriors living on a world that made even Seleucus Secundus look gentle, to build an army the Landsraad had never accounted for, a force from outside the system entirely. The Fremen had no seat in the Landsraad. They held no CHOAM directorships. They had never declared Canley on anyone. They existed outside the entire architecture of galactic politics. And it was precisely that position, outside the cage, beyond the rules, invisible to the system designed to track and contain every ambitious family in the known universe, that made them the most dangerous force the Imperium had ever faced. That is the ultimate irony of this entire political structure. The Landsraad was designed to prevent any single force from gaining too much power. But it did so by creating a system so rigid, so resistant to change, so committed to preserving the status quo, that when change finally came, it could only come as a catastrophe. The system had no capacity for evolution, no mechanism for gradual reform, no way to incorporate new voices or new realities. It could only shatter. Herbert was writing about more than a fictional parliament. He was writing about empires, about the way concentrated power justifies itself through tradition and ritual, about the way elites create systems that appear to serve the common good, but actually serve to keep the elite in place. The Landsraad is Rome and Versailles and the British East India Company and every hereditary power structure that has ever convinced itself it was the natural order of things. The CHOAM dividend system is a feudal tax apparatus dressed in corporate language. The Canley Code is trial by combat, given a coat of legal paint. The atomic span is a non-proliferation treaty enforced not by inspectors, but by the threat of universal annihilation. And the Bene Gesserit breeding program is eugenics wrapped in mysticism, pursued by women who believe so deeply in their own wisdom that they cannot see how their manipulations have already sown the seeds of their own irrelevance. The system rewards treachery, but only treachery performed with the correct aesthetic. It punishes honesty, but only when honesty threatens the comfortable fiction that everyone at the table is playing by the rules. Duke Leto was dangerous not because he was ambitious, but because he was genuinely admired. In a system that runs on cynicism, sincerity is the most destabilizing force imaginable. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson the Landsraad offers to those willing to hear it. That stability purchased through suppression is not stability at all. It is stored energy. It is pressure building behind a dam. The longer the dam holds, the more devastating the flood when it finally breaks. Duke Leto sat in that briefing room and asked the wrong question. He asked which houses would help him. The right question, the one Paul eventually answered not with words, but with a holy war that consumed the galaxy, was not about which houses would help. It was about what happens when you stop playing by the house's rules altogether. The Landsraad never saw them coming, because the Landsraad was built to watch the prisoners, not the desert beyond the walls. The golden age of the Imperium, that 10,000-year reign of House Carino, ended not with a grand battle between noble houses or a dramatic vote in the Hall of Oratory. It ended with a boy from a murdered family riding a sandworm across the shield wall, carrying a name the Fremen gave him, Muad'Dib, the one the Bene Gesserit's own Missionaria Protectiva had prepared the desert people to follow. The very tool the Sisterhood had planted to protect their agents became the weapon that unmade their plans. And the cage that had contained the great families for 100 centuries came apart at the seams. If the Landsraad teaches us anything, it is this: no system of power, however ancient, however intricate, however ruthlessly maintained, is permanent.